I hope everyone can hear me. Okay. Good evening. This is Mark Clevey. I'm the host of our GLR's 2023 Renewable Energy Summit tonight, Thursday, September 14th, 2023. Tonight, we're going to be talking about greening the solar supply chain, the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance, and how it is changing the face of solar energy across the country. Our presentation tonight is by Michael Parr, who's the executive director of the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance. Listed his website and his email there. Our sponsors tonight are the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes Eagle, McNaughton-McKay, and Harvest Solar. And those of you who are interested, we'd love you to go to our website, glrea.org, and look up our membership if you have an interest in joining us and being a part of what we're trying to do in Michigan these days. Okay, let's see if I can get this to move. I don't know why it's not moving. So, sponsored by GLREA, the Renewable Energy Seminar is part of our monthly solar series program. It was created and operated by John Sarber, who's recording tonight with us. Our renewable energy seminars cover topics of interest to renewable energy users, businesses, advocates, and stakeholders. Seminars include content ranging from technology to business to public policy. The Renewable Energy Seminar is a Zoom event held the second Thursday of the month from 7 to 8 p.m. Related questions, comments, suggestions, etc., should be directed to me as your host, and my email is there, mclevey123@gmail.com. I ask you also to please remember to mute yourself. There's nothing more disruptive for a speaker than to have someone talking at their dog or asking their wives to bring them a beer. So all those are good questions as long as you're muted. At the end, also, please hold all your questions to the end. You can raise your hand under reactions and to ask a question. So I'll call on you and we can get your question fielded by Michael. So, as the founder and host of GLREA's Renewable Energy Seminar, again, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Michael Parr, who is the executive director of the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance. I also want to thank Phil Rausch, Hemlock Semiconductor, and Mark Verda from McNaughton-McKay for their help in bringing Michael to Michigan. It's one of the solar industry's most vexing paradoxes. The manufacturing and production of solar modules is a greenhouse gas, fossil fuel, and resource-intensive industry. And although solar is a key climate change risk mitigation technology, many solar modules sold in the United States today have low cell efficiency, contain lead, are not recyclable, and contain high levels of embedded carbon. Tonight, Michael Parr will talk about a disruptive solar innovation, ultra low embedded carbon solar, that is rapidly changing all this for the better. High cell efficiency, ultra pure silicon, green, lead-free, recyclable, low embedded carbon, sustainable, cost competitive, solarized, advanced manufacturing. These are the terms associated with this new disruptive solar innovation. An innovation that's being led in Michigan by world-class companies such as Hemlock Semiconductor, Dow Solar, Meyer Burger, McNaughton-McKay, and cities like Ann Arbor that offer special manufacturing discounts for these sustainable solar products through their highly successful Solarize Ann Arbor program. And as I move, I guess on a final note, as I move into my final act of my long solar career, my sincere wish is that Michigan finally gets its solar-related economic development act together and gets serious about making Michigan a world leader in the advanced manufacturing of these ultra-low embedded carbon solar modules. And I invite you to go to the Low Carbon Solar Alliance website and see who are the members. Not only are these companies members, but there are many. And with that said, Michael, I welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate everybody showing up. As Mark said, I lead an organization called the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance, which is an association of solar manufacturers across the supply chain, all of whom have already worked to lower the carbon intensity of their own manufacturing. And jointly, we are trying to use market demand signals to decarbonize the global solar supply chain. I am going to kind of a fair warning, throw lots of information at you all tonight. So I apologize. It's a little bit of a rat-a-tat pace, but there's quite a bit I'm going to try to get through. And I welcome all your questions. Let me get started up here. Okay, you all can see my screen, and I can almost guarantee that after Mark's intro, that the dog barking that you're going to hear will be my dogs. So just fair warning. So what I want to try to do is kind of give you a little tour of what are the sustainability issues in solar, where do they arise, and what we're trying to do about them. This won't be a surprise to anybody. The solar supply chain is very heavily concentrated in China. 80 to 98% of each of the major steps in the solar value chain concentrated in China. While China's made progress on its grid, it is still quite a carbon intensive grid, roughly twice the carbon intensity of the US grid. And most of the solar panels deployed in America today come out of this very high carbon Chinese grid, simply because that's where most of it's made. Big change over the last 15 years, an industry that was a small specialized industry, largely based in the US, Europe, Japan, now intervening 10 years, 15 years of Chinese state policy, enormous in scale, technologically sophisticated, very low cost, but also high carbon and other challenges, and some trade behaviors like dumping in foreign markets that have caused a fair bit of up and down in solar industry. How much different? As I said, the grid's about double the carbon intensity of the US grid. So a module that comes out of a Chinese supply chain is roughly twice its carbon intensive as one that comes out of North American supply chain, even more so for products made in Europe, just because Europe has a slightly cleaner grid than do we. Why does that matter? Well, there are estimates that if over the next 20 years, if the majority of solar manufacturing continues to be in China, and it will grow in scale dramatically because global demand is growing, this could mean, on the order of additional 15 to 20 billion tons of CO2 emissions just from the solar industry alone. And were that the case, the solar industry would grow to surpass the global aluminum industry in its scale as a global CO2 emitter. And you will probably recognize aluminum as one of the larger emitting industries. So the bogey here is pretty big. You also have heard about extensive reporting on forced labor in the Chinese supply chain. This actually overlaps with the high carbon because most of this is occurring in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is where most of the polysilicon in the world is made. Very carbon, coal-intense grid, and the use of Uyghurs, Turkmen, and other Muslim minorities as forced laborers. Various factors have conspired to create significant supply challenges in solar. You'll sometimes hear the term the solar coaster. Whether it's years of tariffs associated with Chinese dumping of products in the US market. We're currently seeing that happen in Europe. Whether it's the disruption during COVID and supply chains went sideways globally and created all kinds of problems for supply for solar for the US. Whether it's more recent trade cases that determined that Chinese companies who had moved out of China and set up operations in Southeast Asia were really just trying to evade the tariffs, and they were still dumping products. They were circumventing tariffs, and they will now bear heavier tariffs. And down in the bottom left corner, you can see summary from the International Energy Agency, who basically said, this supply chain is a problem. It is so heavily concentrated that it represents a significant vulnerability. and they encouraged the world to work its way away from this high carbon supply chain. Another thing that we are seeing is because supply is getting increasingly unreliable and these concerns about sustainability in the supply chain, buyers, particularly in the US, are taking risk reduction steps. So they're taking business actions to reduce their supply chain risks by long-term supply agreements with some of the major US PV producers. And this has gone everywhere from polysilicon orders all the way right through to finished modules. This is one of the factors that's driving a significant boom in US PV manufacturing. We are seeing dramatic growth in manufacturing over many elements of the solar supply chain now for a variety of reasons. Talked about sustainability concerns and supply risks. You will be aware that our relationship with China grows increasingly fraught, both as a trade and as a geopolitical and military matter. And I think people are increasingly aware of the strategic risk of relying on China for the single fastest growing source of energy production globally, and certainly here in the US. And China has already threatened several times to reduce trade in various clean energy related minerals and materials, and not unlike Russia has done with gas. And I think that's top of mind for the US government. I'm sure you've heard a great deal about the Inflation Reduction Act, incredible incentives both for US PV manufacturing and deployment of solar, and the deployment incentives have a really strong signal for use of domestic content in solar panels that are used. So those are both driving significant movement towards more manufacturing in the US. The DOE has a loan program office that is very nicely funded, run by solar professionals, basically helps to create access to capital for manufacturers to make some of the high cost investments in solar for some of the startup companies or small to mid-sized companies that have a hard time with capital. As I'll elaborate a little more, we're seeing growing market demand for solar that does not bear some of the challenges of the Chinese solar supply chain. So free of forced labor, low carbon. And as Mark said, we're also seeing growing demand for higher efficiency, more sophisticated cell types in PV modules. We've seen a big transition in the last several years towards increasingly pure polysilicon in solar cells, such as would be produced by Hemlock. And we are seeing a burst of innovation in driving higher levels of conversion efficiency for solar cells, so more of the sunlight converted to electrical energy. HJT, such as what Meyer Burger makes, their partnership with McNaughton-McKay, is one of the promising contenders there, as are a type of mineral assemblage called perovskites that you may have heard of, that are a lot of work going on in that area. And the other thing that we're seeing that's quite interesting is part of this de-risking of supply chains. PV buyers are essentially investing in US manufacturing capacity with the way they contract solar. So they're signing multi-year, multi-gigawatt supply deals with front-end loaded payment terms, and in so doing, driving capital into the manufacturing sector, and that's proving to work quite well. There are a host of policy drivers as well that are affecting both the US and the EU. You know, our supply chain is reasonably well integrated with the EU, and so growth in the EU is a positive thing. France has now had for over a decade carbon footprint standards. So if you're going to bid a solar project into the public grid, you have to use their method to calculate the embodied carbon, and they then have a third party body that verifies your calculation. And the lower your carbon, the more preferable score on your bid and the more preferable the power pricing you'll receive if you do win the award. When mentioned IRA, there's also the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which extends some very long-standing 1920s trade law to forced labor in solar products, and that has stopped a lot of imports into the U.S. It requires exceptionally rigorous documentation to demonstrate that your products don't go back to some of the sources of forced labor in Xinjiang province. And not many companies have successfully done that. What we're unfortunately seeing is a lot of those modules that can't get into the US are going to Europe, and there's a huge buildup in inventory and warehouses in Europe at the moment. Prices have collapsed to the point that the European manufacturers are struggling. The EU is moving towards giving the member states the ability to implement similar policies to restrict imports of products with forced labor. I don't expect enforcement in Europe to be nearly as vigorous as it is here. Europe also is bringing into force a carbon border adjustment tax, which basically levies a tax, a tariff, if you will, on products based on their carbon intensity. The first round of products covered will not include solar, but we can foresee that coming. And there's some very active discussion within the U.S. Senate, bipartisan basis, to talk about a carbon border adjustment program for the U.S. as well. As I mentioned before, I think both the U.S. and EU, the dramatic effects of Russia using natural gas as a geopolitical weapon are still very fresh in people's minds, and we don't want to recreate that in solar. We're also seeing more clear signals from buyers that they want sustainably manufactured solar. So two of the large U.S. solar developers, Lightsource BP and Silicon Ranch, are both actively seeking sustainably manufactured low carbon modules in their procurement. The Clean Energy Buyers Institute, which is the think tank arm of the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which is an NGO whose members are all the big solar buyers in the U.S., are pushing for member adoption of buying specifications that favor low carbon solar. And the U.S. government is now specifying low carbon sustainably made solar in modules in government purchases, including power purchase agreements. You see the term EPEAT there. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. EPEAT is a global eco-label and purchasing standard for sustainable solar. This is a traditional ANSI type standard. It's multi-attribute, so it covers a wide variety of ESG criteria and carbon footprint, life cycle based. The criteria are transparent and developed in voluntary consensus process by industry stakeholders. To meet this standard requires extensive documentation, including clear audit trails of your suppliers. Your performance against the standard is verified by independent third-party entities. You have to demonstrate every year that you continue to meet it, and there are random audits and to ensure compliance, and the criteria can get refreshed as often as every 3 years to make sure they stay current. So this is a tier 1 eco label, which is sort of the gold standard of eco labels. EPEAT's been around since 2006 for electronic products, driven billions of dollars in sustainable purchasing. The solar criteria under EPEAT are relatively new. To give you a feel for the rigor of this, both a lot of public input and multiple steps. So first, you have to go out and do academic research on what are the sustainability issues that need to be addressed. Then technical experts draft the criteria that underlie the standards. You assemble an expert ad hoc group, and this involved industry experts, NGOs, academics, government experts, and they vet those criteria, modify them, and then approve them. And then that goes to yet another multi-stakeholder group called the technical committee that does the final review and approval with public input again, and then it goes final. And that just happened about 6 months ago. You can see it covers an extensive range of ESG criteria, carbon content, energy use, energy efficiency in manufacturing, circularity, so recycled content, was designed for recycling. Does the manufacturer of a product take back and recycling program in place? Do you have clear material recovery targets in that recycling? Are you using water efficiently in your manufacturing? Chemicals of concern, right through more traditional governance elements of social performance, worker rights, etc. And so this is a really rigorous, very broad standard that requires extensive documentation to meet. There are about half a dozen PV module companies currently pursuing this. And, this is a 6 to 12 month process costing several $100,000 to do. So it is not a simple thing. Let me talk a little bit about the low carbon criteria that are part of that EP standard. So we talked about how the Chinese manufacturing is very high carbon. And we talked about the French EV low carbon standards for their bidding. This criteria draws from work done by the French, also by work done by folks in other parts of Europe, and work done by the IEA in their PV focus group. So it's a cradle to gate standard, meaning all the inputs to the manufacturing and the manufacturing itself. So all the way back to mining quartz for the metallurgical grade silicon, refining the silicon to polysilicon, making the solar cell, making the solar wafer, the solar cell, and the module. It stops there because that constitutes the vast majority of the carbon footprint of manufacturing in PV. Shipping is a relatively small part. And this is really trying to look at the manufacturing footprint. So it doesn't include the elements of the module in use. Okay? It includes all the major materials, including the aluminum frame, the glass top, everything that goes into it. There are kind of two approaches a module maker can take to work their way through the process. The simplified approach is sort of a lookup table for carbon values, where we have calculated for each manufacturing step the countries it takes place in, the carbon intensity of their grid, average carbon intensity of manufacturing in that country. So there'll be a number. You make your polysilicon in Germany, there's a number for carbon intensity of polysilicon per gram in Germany. You have that made into a wafer in Vietnam, there's a number for that. Cell in Germany, a number for that, etc. The second path is detailed site-specific life cycle analysis based on a methodology that's detailed out in the criteria. And so basically you as a module company can use either path A or path B for each of the major steps in your manufacturing supply chain based on what's going to give you the best carbon footprint number. So if you have superior carbon performance in some elements of your supply chain, you'll want to do path B for those to highlight it. If you don't have particularly, you're good, but you're not particularly outstanding, then path A is a much simpler and more cost-effective way to go. All of these calculations are based on national or where they exist subnational grid carbon intensities as published by the IEA. So one of the things we did very carefully in developing this was to minimize the opportunity for cheating, frankly. And so all of the data has to come from publicly available databases of the most recent data published by the IEA, and there's just very little opportunity for cheating in this system. The calculations do allow you to account for renewable energy in your manufacturing, including renewable energy purchased in PPAs, but there are very, very high quality standards for that. And frankly, at the moment, no manufacturer in China could meet these quality standards because their renewable energy credit market is not sufficiently developed. And just to give you a feel for the rigor, the component specifics for a finished module have got to be validated by invoices, receipts, purchase orders, all sorts of detail. How many grams of silicon are in your wafers? How many grams of encapsulant are on the cells? How many grams of glass are in that module? Excuse me. And that also has to include loss and breakage during manufacturing. So you buy so much, but some percentage of that material doesn't end up in a finished product because there's loss in manufacturing, modules get broken and don't get sold, and all that has to be accounted for. And just to confirm that that's being done right, you have to submit your module to an independent third-party lab that will disassemble and measure every single component in that module to confirm the component specs in the materials, the documentation you supplied. It requires independent inspection of suppliers, et cetera, and then third-party validation of all these calculations. All this to say it's an exceptionally rigorous standard, which is why it's an ANSI standard and a Type 1 eco label. So how do you reduce the carbon intensity of solar manufacturing? You start all the way back at making the polysilicon, really start even a step before that in how you, what's the fuel used in reducing quartz, which is silicon dioxide, to metallurgical grade silicon, which is 98% pure silicon. So basically, you strip the oxygen off of the quartz. Then polysilicon, as you make in Hemlock, Michigan, exceptionally energy intensive process. And so what is the carbon intensity of the grid you draw from? What's the manufacturing energy efficiency of that particular operation? What are the technologies are you applying? Are they specifically energy efficient, such as fluidized bed reactor technology? All these different ways that you can lower the carbon footprint of polysilicon production. Similarly, making the polysilicon ingot, this is another energy intensive process. You remelt that ultra pure polysilicon, which is 99 and 7/9 purity, 8/9 purity, into a long rod called an ingot. A wafer is sliced off with an ultra thin diamond wire saw, and then the surface is treated to make it give it higher efficiency in light capture. So all of the same, what kind of grid are you drawing from? How efficient is your manufacturing? Are you recycling some of the raw materials like the very expensive sawdust called kerf that you create when you saw that wafer off? The lowest carbon wafers in the world right now come from Norway, unsurprisingly, because it's essentially a 100% hydro grid. Then that cell wiring is built up on it to help get the energy that is generated from the conversion of sunlight to electricity out of the cell. It is encapsulated in a polymer to keep it stable. And then that's laid onto a polymer backsheet and frame put on it and glass put on the top. And each of those steps, you can, depending on what kind of grid you're in, how much self-generated renewables you use, efficiency of your manufacturing, materials efficiency in your operation, all tools to turn down the carbon footprint. So as you can see, it's not a simple process, but there are lots of opportunities to do it for companies that care to try. So why would somebody go through all of that effort to both decarbonize your manufacturing and then to demonstrate it by achieving this eco label? Well, one, if you can meet EPEAT, you have demonstrated really good transparency, traceability, and sustainability of supply chain. That's increasingly important to buyers. You've demonstrated a low carbon footprint, and a lot of the buying companies, particularly the big tech companies, have big goals in so-called scope 3 carbon emissions reductions. And these are scope 3 emissions way up your supply chain, out of your direct control. This is an exceptionally easy purchasing standard, so the buyer no longer has to look at life cycle analyses and compare one to another, determine if it's properly prepared. All they have to do is say, specify EPEAT modules in their buying, and all of that hard work is done for them by others. Using EPEAT to specify module buys has the benefit of sending a very strong demand signal to manufacturers. Hey, people want to buy this better solar. Well, then I think I'll make better solar. And that's our goal long term, that we want to change the way solar is made globally, not just in the US. We want to see China decarbonize its solar industry. And if that's the price required to continue to get access to the US market, that's not a bad carrot. We also think that fundamentally, by incentivizing low carbon PV manufacturing, you're de-risking your mid to long term PV supply by essentially creating more supply available here in the US. If the manufacturer is pretty straightforward, there's competitive advantage in a sustainability driven market. You are strengthening customer relations because you are allowing them to say to their stakeholders, I know the solar panels I buy are clean. And this increased demand for low carbon solar helps justify manufacturing expansions in the US. So there you have it. That is a whole lot of information in a pretty brief bit of time. And I would now be happy to take questions from folks.
So hold on just a second. Let me open this up now. So go into the reactions, and you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you. We can get a question asked and go there. Dave, you'll be next. I'm gonna ask my first question because I want to make sure I get this in. So you talked about manufacturers, and you talked about the companies, you talked about the benefits. What would be a benefit to a state like Michigan? I mean, it spends a fair amount of money putting solar on our things, way stations and rest stations up and down the expressways, on government buildings and things like that. I mean, why wouldn't a state do that? I don't understand. Do you have examples of some states that have said, well, yeah, of course, this makes sense. Reasonable. We should do this. We should pass laws. We should vote, and the governor should say something about it in public. Maybe run on that platform. Why isn't that happening? Or is it not? Where is it happening?
So, as I mentioned, that's already occurred at the federal level. So this is a specification standard for the federal government in purchasing solar. And they're quite clear about why they're doing it, to essentially drive more US solar manufacturing, right? To use the market demand signal to bolster manufacturing. I know the governor is aware. Certainly she and Secretary Granholm have been to Hemlock, and they know what's going on in Hemlock. We've certainly educated the federal government deeply about EPEAT and the purchasing standard. We've also talked to quite a few public utility commissions, including Michigan's, and I know this is something that the public utility commissions are thinking about and looking at. Because the eco label is fairly new and companies are just going through the process of certifying to it now, there are not EP registered modules in the market yet. There will be later this year and more next year, and it'll grow quickly over time. So some governments may be waiting until there are competitive products in the market before they specify. But I do think the fact that the federal government does it is a really good way to go to state governments and say, look, the federal government's decided they're going to specify this, and as soon as there are 2 or more competitive products in the market, it's a requirement to buy it. Why shouldn't we do the same thing? Mm-hmm. And in the same way that the federal government doing it spurs more manufacturing, Hemlock will be one of the big winners in a market driven by low carbon solar. And so for the state of Michigan to specify low carbon solar will also help Hemlock expand because it will create more market demand for their product.
So I hope that is the case because under a previous administration, I remember Dow Solar having a conversation directly with them, and they were launching a program with 13 states to promote solar and spend marketing dollars and stuff. And Michigan wasn't one of those states. And I asked them about that, and they said, "Well, it's just business. Some states are much more business friendly to our solar products, and Michigan's just not one of them." So I certainly hope Hemlock Semiconductor is more successful in getting this administration to wake up, because I think it's basically harmonizing state procurement laws with federal procurement laws, which isn't rocket science. And given the amount of money that comes in through Energy Star and other programs through our energy office, we're going to have to be doing that anyway. So hopefully that can be sped up. I guess as a side question, we have 13 programs, universities and colleges in Michigan that teach solar programs. If they wanted to incorporate something about ultra low carbon solar in their programs, couldn't they do that simply by contacting the association? And are there curriculum materials that are readily available for them to incorporate into their lectures?
We don't have curriculum materials, but I think there's a lot of information on our website. And I do know, for example, there's a professor at a Michigan school that was part of the multi-stakeholder process to develop the eco label standards. And she's a life cycle expert in solar, so I've had a lot to contribute. There's a lot of good data out there. The National Renewable Energy Lab has done a lot of work in this space. They've been a great partner for us. There's an increasing amount of academic work in this space. And so I do think it is a ripe area for academic consideration.
Me too. Oh, excellent. All right, Dave Curtis, you're on.
And here I am. I'd just like to know if you could comment on the auxiliary equipment, the inverters and the controllers. Will the interface between these new panels be the same? And will that equipment also be produced in the States, hopefully?
Yep. So, a low carbon module is no different in any fundamental way other than, lower carbon intensity manufacturing than any other modules. And the EP standard also covers inverters. I haven't seen any inverter companies yet step up, but it does cover them. We are seeing it. One of the beneficial effects, and you guys will know this from Michigan, and how industrial economies work. The more people start manufacturing solar, the more they want to localize their supply chain. So they want everything from, inverters to the encapsulant polymers, to the solar glass, to the aluminum frames, localized as well. And so we are seeing increasing expansion of manufacturing all across the solar supply chain. because people want to be able to get, they want to have a relationship with their suppliers and get their materials. We're seeing trackers expand manufacturing here. We're seeing inverters expand manufacturing. And I'm pleased to see that some of the tracker folks are really working on decarbonization as well by emphasizing recycled steel in their products. And so I think we're seeing kind of the traditional manufacturing virtuous circle emerge.
Michael, with the same silicon, ultra pure silicon that's being used in these solar modules, it's also being used in electronics. So there's a benefit there with the electronics that is happening as well, isn't it? And the Electronics Industry Association, for example, is talking about low carbon.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting overlap. Most of the polysilicon companies, and Hemlock Semiconductor is a good example, started life making ultra high purity silicon for semiconductors. So that's what the market was. And then when solar really started to take off, they added additional manufacturing capacity for solar. It started out several orders of magnitude lower purity than the semiconductor. It has been a much bumpier ride in terms of the market because they've had to compete against China, and China doesn't play very nicely. But increasingly, as people seek higher and higher and higher levels of efficiency from solar modules, the purity of polysilicon required is creeping up closer and closer to semiconductor grade. It's getting actually pretty close to semiconductor grade. And that is another reason why companies like Hemlock have a competitive advantage so long as they are not, best to express it. The challenge for manufacturing in solar is the Chinese industry grows at just unbelievable rates. They just in 2023 doubled the global polysilicon production capacity in 1 year. It had taken us 40 years to get to this stage, and they doubled it in a year. And what happens? Prices crash into the bottom. We are seeing actually something of a bifurcation in the polysilicon market where people are so desperate to get their hands on low carbon poly that US and EU poly producers are selling at 3x the price that the Chinese guys are selling at, because people want the low carbon for flavor-free poly. If we can continue that bifurcation, it will support strong manufacturing economics in the US. But it's always a challenge if you wake up one morning and you built a plant that makes, cost you $10 to make something, and China's selling it $6. It's not a good business to be in, and that's been a challenge for the solar industry here in the US in the last 10 years.
Ernest, you're on.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a homeowner in Ann Arbor, and I'm considering a solar installation. So I guess what I understand is the certification process is just in its infancy. But I saw the Meyer Burger mentioned and so forth to McNaughton-McKay. So I guess my question is, do you have any recommendations for somebody in my situation who's interested in moving on a solar project? What advice might you give someone like me?
Let me answer that because I know the answer very well. The Solarize Ann Arbor program is now formed a relationship with McNaughton-McKay. McNaughton-McKay is representing Meyer Burger panels in Michigan, and they're selling them around already in Michigan through a number of companies, including Absolute Solar and Homeland Solar and a couple others. If you contact Julie Roth and do your solar project through the city's Solarize Ann Arbor program, you can get the Meyer Burger panels. You can get up to a 15% discount on those panels, and you can also get another set of discounts because they're aggregated purchases. So you become part of a aggregated pool of a number of people who are buying through that program. Julie's installed over 4 megawatts of solar in their program in the last 2 years. So so those panels are available now.
Excuse me. So I did attend a meeting a week or two ago.
Okay.
And it wasn't there was obviously that the contractor and installer for that one had a particular panel that they were recommending, but it was clear from the audience of the meeting that they have sourced, other panel manufacturers.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I guess that was because these things are normally sort of focused on the installer, right? That each group seems to be concentrated or focused with a particular installer.
Yes. Yes.
You did mention
But-
Homeland, which is one I've been thinking about. That was not the
Right.
one for the meeting I attended.
So the way that works is that a person, let's say yourself, a person says, I'm going to buy a solar system and I've selected Homeland Solar, and we're going to buy the ultra low carbon solar modules. And at that point, Julie helps out and says, okay, who wants to join in this aggregation? So as soon as the aggregation meets a minimum threshold, all of the discounts kicked in, and then you all get your systems basically at the same time. So what happens is the one you went to, somebody had already indicated another company. So
Right.
There may be more than one, but I know for sure Absolute Solar and Homeland Solar are both leading McNaughton-McKay installers, and they carry these Meyer Burger panels, and they're for sale now. And if you buy it through the City of Ann Arbor's program, you get a manufacturer's discount on those panels. The other panels that are being sold, you do not get a manufacturer's discount. And so you should be clear about this, that the way the aggregation works, if you get 10 people agree to buy their solar system, the installer will give you a cost of sales discount. Then basically that means that what it costs them to find and make and sell the job, they take that off the retail price. So you get a cost of sales discount. If you buy the ultra low carbon panels, you get a manufacturer's discount on top of the cost of sales discount.
Okay. And that's if you have the appropriate numbers for the people participating in the group.
Yeah, but that's what the program's for, is to get the appropriate numbers up. So
and all parties on those parties all need to be, if I understand it right, they all need to be purchasing the same type of panels, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you would have an aggregation project around these panels, either through Absolute Solar or Homeland Solar, for example, and that's how it would work. And so Julie would help you put that together. That's what it does. Now you could go back. You could put on a workshop just like the one you attended. You could do one at your house, invite your neighborhood association and your friends in, and get it started. Usually it takes about a month to put together an aggregation pool and pull this off. From start.
And Ernest, maybe the other thing I would mention, the Meyer Burger panels do have a really good carbon footprint. They're U.S. made polysilicon, and the wafers are made in Norway, so they're quite good.
Mm-hmm.
For solar panels are also very low. They use a thin film technology, which is inherently more energy efficient and carbon efficient. Q Cells also makes a good low carbon panel. And there's a US based company called Helien. That's a upper Midwest company, Minnesota, that makes a quite a good module as well. So they're a variety, and at least one of the big national installation companies, Sunrun, is very interested in buying EP registered modules when they come onto the market. So I think over time it's going to get easier and easier for homeowners to get these, because you're going to see some of the big companies advertising that they install EP registered solar panels.
Right.
Okay, thank you. But in lieu of and since the registration or the certification isn't quite there yet, this is helpful for guiding a more immediate decision. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So 7:50. Any other questions? So I see that Dan Radomski is online here. Dan runs an incubator through Lawrence Technological Institute, which is one of the leading solar universities in Michigan for many, many years. And he has entrepreneurs and innovators who are launching new ventures and things like that. If you had to put on your crystal ball and say, you know, the kinds of innovations that are needed going forward to take this technology and run with it, how would you answer that, Michael?
I'm sorry, run that by me again. I was
I guess looking forward,
reading something in the chat. I apologize.
I was thinking that for entrepreneurial high technology companies that want to launch new ventures in this space and be part of the Ultra Low Carbon Alliance, what do you think are some of the technological frontiers where a smart entrepreneur who has access to venture capital and resources and stuff, and a good incubator like the one Dan Radomski operates, you know, where do you see the cutting edge for somebody who wants to think about being part of this thing?
So I mentioned perovskite, highly specialized technology. You know, and solar's not necessarily a business to get into without any background at all, because it's pretty complex manufacturing. Although just assembling the modules, highly automated, you stand a plant up and be running in less than a year. And the tax incentives and Inflation Reduction Act are quite attractive. So that's not a bad business. I think energy storage, we really, 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 really need to dematerialize energy storage. You know, there's only so much lithium in the world, only so much cobalt, and we get cobalt and nickel from some places that it's not exactly mined carefully. So there's a lot of work being done on, you know, iron air batteries and other kinds of things that don't have such a big material footprint to them and big long supply chains. Improving the longevity of these batteries. The other area that I think is really interesting is end-of-life management. Starting to see people take recycling of solar panels seriously and trying to maximize the materials recovery from them. Right now, most of it's going to landfills, but we're making progress on that. Similarly, for batteries, people are trying to figure out how to maximize materials recovery from batteries. So instead of going out to mine minerals from the ground, you can mine minerals from renewable energy products. So those are some of the areas that I find particularly interesting. There are a few companies who are working on highly innovative technologies to make these solar wafers because they're a very energy intensive part of the supply chain, and China dominates that part of the market, and so prices are really, really low. And there are some people looking at some innovative technologies that take 3 or 4 major manufacturing steps out of that process and allow them to produce at a much lower price point, and therefore they could have decent profit margins in a market with pretty low pricing. But those companies have all got 15, 20 years of work on their technologies. It's not something you just kind of do overnight.
Let's get a question in. Lee Andre, Lee's got his hand up. Lee, he hasn't asked a question yet. Lee, you're on.
Yeah, my question was a little bit like,
you're breaking up.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Are there some industries that exist right now, not new things, but you think they'll follow the same pathway to become ultra low carbon? You know, like the silicon carbide business, which is growing because of high amperage switching and stuff like that. Would that industry go ahead and do it? And the plastics industry, if they use the captured carbon off of a smokestack or out of the air, what would their carbon footprint look like? Could you comment on, you know, some of those ways of measuring the rest of our economy?
Yeah, a really interesting question, Lee. And you know, I've spent 30 years in the chemical industry, and so I have a pretty good feel for
Well, I
that
should say I
manufacturing
spent
sector.
30 years in the chemical industry, also working for Bacher. So
And, you know, it's a really good question. You know how energy intensive silicon production is. Um, the I think in solar's a little unique in that it's a clean energy, and the idea of having a clean energy product made with dirty energy kind of makes people's heads hurt a little bit, and people who are buying solar have big sustainability brands they're trying to protect. A little less so for some of these other more commoditized materials. I do think, though, we're seeing a big push to decarbonize steel, cement, glass, aluminum, and I think we are going to see a price on carbon, inevitably. And so I do think almost any energy intensive manufacturer, particularly in the US where, our energy costs are relatively high, they've got to be thinking about, at the very least, how do they reduce the energy intensity of their manufacturing from an economic standpoint, and also as you look at how the investment community increasingly is factoring sustainability factors into their investing, I think there are a lot of socioeconomic pressures that are driving almost everybody to take their carbon footprint pretty seriously.
So we got, I think, time for one last question. Ernest, you got your hand up still? You have another question, or is that an old
No,
question?
sorry, I just forgot to put my hand down.
Okay.
I'll
So
take-
Lee,
we take
did you get your question answered sufficiently?
Well, yes, he explained that basically every industry is going to do it. Unfortunately, I also grow corn, and I don't know that the Farm Bureau is believing that their corn crop is. They're still trying to convince people that corn is a low carbon fuel.
Yeah. Yeah, well, DTE is trying to convince us that methane spewed fracked gas is clean. So yes, we got a battle ahead of us. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding here.
Yeah, I would like people to be a little more careful about how they badmouth renewable natural gas. We should maintain some combustion processes if we can drive them with renewable, carbon atoms.
Well, actually, they can. There is a blockchain technology. There's green gas available out of Texas and all over the place. We just don't have, our utilities choose not to buy gas that is proven, monitored from the wellhead to the furnace or stuff to show that it's
and
doesn't
one
leak
way to
methane.
help us determine which is which would be to talk about point sources and non-point sources of
Absolutely.
CO2 emissions.
I agree totally.
The
I agree totally.
tailpipe in my furnace, are non-point sources. And so you either let it go or you stop burning the gas. But
I think we should have a renewable energy seminar on that going forward. So
yeah, we should say point sources are okay as long as we know that someday we'll put capture on them.
yes, sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to tonight. I think it was a really good session. I want to thank Michael for putting up with us, and Hemlock Semiconductor for putting Phil Ross for putting me on Mike's list so I could chase him down and get him here. Michael, we thank you so very much. You would send me a copy of your PowerPoint. I would appreciate it. This presentation is going to be posted on the GLREA's YouTube and will be available for people to see. So with that, again, I thank you very much. And next month, we're going to be having a presentation by Chuck Hookham on community energy storage. And I'm sure he'll be talking about battery technologies as well. And then we're going to end up this year. The City of Ann Arbor has been working on a report on whether or not they should launch a sustainable energy utility in Ann Arbor. That report is coming out this month. and Dr. Missy Stultz will be here in November to talk about the report and what the city has decided to do. Are they going to vote to become a municipal utility, or are they going to choose some other option? And she's going to talk about that, the process that the Ann Arbor is going through, what the report said, and what they're going to be doing going forward. So I hope you all come for those next two, and that will round out our year. I want to thank John Sarver very much for being a technical support here, keeping me honest and doing all the good stuff we need to have done.